Well, let's get going. Hi, everyone, and welcome to Race and Conversations about Race in America webcast. My name is Dr. Rob Shelby, the Chief Diversity Officer at the University of Evansville. And for those of you who have participated in the past, you're used to my little intro here. You see there's more faces on the screen today. And it does not, each day that passes, it becomes even more pressing to me, just the unprecedented times that we're living in. And, you know, what really kind of precipitated or got this conversation going with this web series related to the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. And certainly there were others that came before those three, but because they kind of happened around this COVID moment at the same time, the protests have been different. The response nationally and even internationally has been somewhat different. And in this moment where we've got social and racial tension, we've got the COVID pandemic taking place. There have been so many other issues that have been highlighted. Calls for reforms to policing and the criminal justice system. There has been racial violence, voter access for state primaries and the lead up to the presidential election, the removal of Confederate statues, and the emergence of social movements. There have been debates about reparations at the local level and so many other topics. Each of these have a race dimension and that are really of significant concern for our community members. So I thought that today I would open with a quote that I know that our guests are familiar with, but I think it really sets the tone nicely for what we'll be talking about. So in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Paulo Freire wrote, and I quote, "For apart from inquiry, apart from praxis, individuals cannot be truly human. Knowledge emerges only through invention and reinvention, through the restless, impatient, continuing, hopeful inquiry human beings pursue in the world, and with each other." This insightful thought from Freire gives shape to our conversation today. But before we do that, before we jump into our talk and I introduce folks, a little bit of housekeeping as always. So the summer portion of the series is scheduled for Wednesdays at 1 o'clock with our final summer session taking place next week on August the 5th. Each session consists of a 1-hour conversation, or at least a gathering. We talk for maybe 35 to 40 minutes. And then for the remaining time, we address questions and comments from you, the participants. So the way that we've done things, and I think this works well, so during today's conversation, you are encouraged to ask questions using the Q&A feature. For me, it's at the bottom of the screen. Wherever yours is, please use it to ask questions. And it allows us to keep track of those questions. And I'll introduce you all to Zaya Lumumba, who is on helping us today. She'll be working with the Q&A section. And then we also have the chat feature enabled, so you can use that to place comments in there. And then, of course, we'll get to those as we kind of get to that Q&A, or at least conversation time. We'll do our best to address your questions and your comments at the end of the conversation portion. So this week's guests are Dr. Davies Bellamy and Dr. Amy Mcbride from the University of Evansville's Department of Education. Dr. Davies Bellamy is an associate professor in the School of Education, a native of Trinidad and Tobago. He was recruited to play soccer for the University of Evansville in 1978. He graduated from UE with a bachelor's degree in accounting in 1982 and a master's degree in community counseling in 1984. From 1984 to 87, he served as director of residence life and co-director of minority affairs at UE. After completing his doctoral coursework in counseling psychology at Indiana State University in 1991, he returned to the University of Evansville as a member of the faculty in the counseling program. He served as director of the counseling program from 92 to 96. And since 2007, he and Dr. Amy Mcbride, who's on the call with us, have been co-teaching a cultural immersion course in Trinidad and Tobago. He is an accomplished educator, as demonstrated by the numerous awards and accolades he has received. Dr. Amy Mcbride is an associate professor of education and coordinator of elementary education junior internship. Prior to coming to the University of Evansville, Dr. Mcbride taught 5th grade in Iowa for 12 years. She earned her bachelor's degree in elementary education with a language arts specialization and a bachelor's degree in English education and secondary education endorsement from the University of Iowa. She earned her master's degree in effective teaching from Drake University and her doctorate in curriculum and instruction in elementary mathematics education from Indiana State University. As the coordinator for the junior year internship program, Dr. Mcbride is proud of her working relationship with the local and regional school systems. She is a qualified administrator of the Intercultural Development Inventory, also known as the IDI, and we'll be talking about that today, and teaches courses on cultural competency on campus. It's no surprise that Dr. Mcbride is a sought-after and award-winning educator. So welcome, Dr. Bellamy and Dr. Mcbride today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure to be here.
Let me also introduce Zaya Lumumba. She is a graduate from Providence Cristo Rey High School. And for those of you who had a chance to, I think, participate a couple of weeks ago when Liera was on, she is also from Providence. So it's like you all are representing quite well. That school is up in Indianapolis, Indiana. And she's a rising junior in the biochemistry department at the University of Evansville. Zaya is also an integral member of the Fellow Scholars Program. And I am glad that Zaya is part of our university community and that she has volunteered to help us out today. Welcome, Zaya.
Hello.
So I usually like to start off our conversation by allowing the folks on the screen or the show to kind of talk about what it is that they do. And because you're professors, I think it's important to kind of highlight the courses that you teach at UE. And then we'll kind of get into, why they're so important, how they came about. And I think to really kind of set the stage, the word that's probably words that are going to be used a lot are going to be like cultural competence today, right? So Amy, do you want to get started?
Sure. Let's see. Most of my time is spent in the School of Education, of course, teaching elementary education courses. So I work anywhere with sophomores, juniors, seniors, helping them learn how to be a teacher. And then I also coordinate the internship program, which is part-time student teaching for our juniors, which is kind of a unique program that we have at the University of Evansville. And then fortunately, I've been able to work with the Multicultural Understanding course, which is for juniors and seniors, where we focus on cultural competency and so forth. We'll talk about more about that today. And I also teach in the Masters of Leadership program with a Leading with Cultural Intelligence course. So.
Great, thank you. Davies?
Since the counseling program folded in 1996, I have been orphaned in the School of Education, and I've taught a variety of courses over the years. Currently, I've been teaching my first course, which is Education 200, Introduction to Diversity in Contemporary Schools, followed by, that's for elementary ed majors. For secondary ed majors, it's called Foundations on Diversity in American Education. And then I also teach the third course, which is Multicultural Understanding.
Great. So I wonder if what we could do in order to build on this is let's kind of invite our participants to kind of listen in on our conversation about cultural competence. What are we talking about? And I gave this really lengthy intro about what's happening in our society And, you know, for me, I guess I would think that's what we would need, right? We need to really gain a sense of cultural competence, cultural empathy. Can you kind of give us a snapshot about what is it that we're talking about here? And either one of you can take that question. Oh, actually, both of you can take it.
Davies, go ahead.
Well, we're essentially talking about the acquisition of awareness, knowledge, and skills, as espoused by Sue and Sue in their Counsel in the Culturally Different text. And so to acquire cultural competence, we begin with becoming aware of one's self, one's beliefs, attitudes, values, assumptions, communication style, and the impact that those have on others. And similarly, recognizing that becoming aware of others and their impact on us via their beliefs, assumptions, values, etc. So that's basically the first leg of cultural competence. The other two areas are knowledge. And with respect to knowledge, we're basically talking about knowledge of groups and knowledge of individuals in those groups, along with the socio-political impact that those groups have experienced. And we're looking at both minority and majority constituents. And then the third would be skills. You must be able to receive and send messages effectively in communicating with others. So those are the three branches or elements of cultural competence, according to Sue and Sue, who are counseling psychologists that we have embraced. Amy?
And if you go with Mitch Hammer, who is actually with the IDI, he talks about cultural competence and intercultural competence as being able to recognize both the similarities and the differences in others so that you can better communicate with them and adapt and accept who you're working with, so that you have, as Davies said, better communication, better actions, and better knowledge for a world in which, as Freire says, it's easier to love, and that is our goal.
So let me ask you a little bit about that cultural competence process. So the way that you just outlined it, it would seem that it could be problematic if we start off with just trying to build skills. And I've seen programs that do that, right? So or efforts, not just programs, I've seen efforts where it's about gaining skills and along the way kind of picking up the do's and don'ts, the cultural do's and don'ts. But it sounds to me like the way that you guys set it up, the way that you're thinking about it, is that you have to start with the self. Can we talk a little bit about that? Why is that part so important?
Well, it's critically important. I think it's one of the cornerstones of what we do, and for that we've borrowed largely from Paulo Freire, a Brazilian education philosopher, who says that it is important for teachers to be simultaneously teachers and students, and similarly for students to be simultaneously students and teachers. So it is something that we do together, as opposed to there being a recognized expert while the others being empty vessels to fill or to shape. And so the notion of starting with self is critically important to our work.
And if you think about it, a lot of times people react or say things and not necessarily understand why. So in our program, if we're examining self, examining your family history, examining where did you come up with these biases and prejudices and stereotypes, where did they come from? You're better able to recognize them for what they are and work on deciding, what am I going to do about it? And claim ownership to things like white privilege, and claim ownership to some of the biases that you have, and then be ready to say, okay, now what?
And sort of what led us on that path is the recognition that for many of us, especially teachers, we tend to think that our students bring a culture or attitudes or behaviors, assumptions to the class, while we are free of those. And so we engage in teaching strategies, etc., only to run aground because there's that intersection of culture and whatever we do, whatever the enterprise is, that is impacted by that culture. One anthropologist, ethnographer, Spradley, defines culture as the acquired knowledge people use to interpret experience and generate behavior. So we recognize, Dr. McBride and myself, we recognize that we have to be very clearly in touch with our values, beliefs, attitudes, etc. In other words, our worldview, the culture that we bring to our classroom and its impact on our students and vice versa. So it is essential that we start with our self-awareness.
And what's interesting, a lot of people think that's very easy. Oh, you just start with yourself. It's actually quite difficult because it's very difficult to accept certain things about yourself and to revisit some aspects that you maybe don't want to claim right away. So it can be a real challenge. It's much easier to notice biases and prejudices of others than it is to recognize within yourself that you might have acted in a way that was not received the way you intended or whatever it might be. So.
Yeah, I think I think this is where why we've kind of gelled so well over the years. Because in our conversations, what I didn't realize until we actually started talking was that the way that I would even teach in my sociology classes when I was a part of the faculty was about that very thing, about if we're going to gain it's not just about appreciation. Appreciation is a step, but what we're talking about is getting to acceptance. We're getting to the point of where and in my courses we're specifically talking about race relations, and I would even add it was race and ethnic relations. So if we think we've got challenges with race, we should really take a broad perspective view of what's happening with ethnic strife around the world. And so I would start in the same place. I would also, starting with the place of understanding self, which does not mean that you start that process and then you end. It's dynamic, which means you're constantly learning, or you're in, as long as you have breath, right? You have the ability to learn about yourself. And those experiences that we have, we interact, we process, we gain perspective. And so I think that's what I've really appreciated over the years in talking with the two of you is that starting place of the self and recognizing that this is challenging work. Can you kind of talk us through, I guess, like what an example would be like as you're, granted, we keep talking about students, but let's take it out of the realm of the student right now, at least as a student in the classroom, recognizing that we're all students, right?
Correct.
Students of life. How do you walk someone through that journey, or even navigate that journey of the self as it relates to cultural competence? So what's the how?
I would say very humbly and very gingerly, because as Amy said earlier, it is difficult for us to acknowledge and accept the biases and prejudices that we bring. Because I think we all like to think that we are much better enlightened than we are, in large part because we have accumulated knowledge and some skills, especially in our professional area.
Yes.
Right. So in that respect, we can say we've arrived to the point where we can lead. when it comes to accepting one's biases and prejudices, that is not as easy, in part because many of them reside in our unconscious, according to Freud. And so until incidents occur, which we call critical incidents, we are blinded to them. And we think that we are soaring, right? We're reaching for the stars. So it's very humbling, as Ferry would say, it is very humbling to get in touch with what we call your personal journey toward cultural competence. And so being able to accept is very important.
Mm.
Mm-hmm. And of course, we go by the Rogerian theories of unconditional positive regard. So for ourselves, for our colleagues, Davies has helped me immensely through my journey through cultural competence. And one of the things that is consistent is the unconditional part. When I share with him or he shares with me, it's unconditional. There's no judgment. And it's just a process. You have to be able to get that out and talk about it and face it in a world where you're not going to be criticized for doing so. And that's one of the things that we've worked really hard. And when we teach our classes, or even with ourselves, our colleagues, we've really tried to be consistent with that principle.
So maybe let's do this for a moment, right? Let's talk about your personal journey. And I warned you that I was going to do this, because here's the reason. And Zaya, you can chime in here too. Zaya knows me well, everyone. So I'm not putting her on the spot. She's probably way too used to me. But here's what I think can happen when we talk about matters of race, right? Especially in higher education, there is the possibility that what we end up doing is hyper intellectualizing it. Now, it certainly has an intellectual dimension to it, but there's also a very guttural, emotive aspect to race. And I could have a whole show on, if race is socially constructed or not. That's a whole nother topic. But in the midst of that, I think sometimes because we're a part of a university, we may lose sight of kind of the emotion that is connected with this. And for our participants, I want you to hear me clearly on this. I think sometimes what happens is that we do hyper intellectualize certain things without giving real credence to what's happening on the inside. So the I keep saying emotion. It's not emotion. It's the emotive side of things. So this is going back to the tensions in the pre and pre-enlightenment and the Enlightenment period of where the focus on the intellect, human intellect, and the tension between the mind and the heart. And what we're saying is that both are engaged here, right? It is not just an exercise in the mind. It is also a lived experience that plays out in some ways in very tragic experiences. So, I mean, I named off 3 people at the beginning of the show who lost their lives because, in very broad sense, because there was a lack of cultural competence that was happening there. So what I wanted to do is kind of carve out this moment for you all to talk about kind of your journey, because if we're saying that the way forward here is to really embark on a journey of self-discovery as a starting place. Kind of walk us through how did this happen for you personally, and then what I want to do is I want to shift to kind of turn our lens somewhat and talk about what happened in the School of Education and how this became a part of the work that you're doing there.
Would you like to go, Amy?
I can. Let's see. Well, for me, you know, I was raised in a white community. Everyone looked like me. There were a few people of color, but very few. And so I was raised in a bubble. And I didn't know that I was raised in a bubble. It just was what it was. And obviously had some instances in college and so forth. But in 2007, Davies asked me if I wanted to go to Trinidad and Tobago on this course, this class. And I thought, palm trees, beaches, I can deal with that. Used to live in Hawaii. This sounds like a plan for me. And that's all I thought it was. Little did I know that the 3 weeks that we spent in someone's home in Trinidad and Tobago would absolutely change my life and make me aware of things that I had taken for granted, that I had never even considered, put me in touch with. I had to think about, for example, how my father raised me, how my mother raised me, and their backgrounds being from Missouri and a very racist background, segregated schools and so minstrel shows and the whole bit, and how that affected me. And it was very emotional. I mean, you say emotive, but it was flat out emotional. And there was moments of regret, and there was moments of sadness, and there was moments of anger. I found myself witnessing events in other people easier, as I mentioned before, than for myself. And I had to stop that and start looking inward at phrases that I was saying and so forth. Probably one of the pivotal things that helped me to turn this into an educational view to help my students was a conference. We went to a NAME conference down in New Orleans, and we were meeting with one of our colleagues, Jean Wool, who lives in Oregon. And she is very versed in the affairs of racial, ethnic, cultural diversity, and so forth. We were having a conversation, and I was using a term that I thought was proper for people who are biracial. That was the only term I knew. And so I was thinking I was being, in those days, politically correct and trying to be sensitive. And bless her heart, we had the conversation, we finished the conversation, and then Jean turned to me and said, now, can we talk about this term that you used earlier? And I said, sure. And she shared with me the history, and she shared with me why that's not a term to use, and blew my mind, you know. And so I learned from that, and I don't use that term anymore. But the point being, she didn't get upset. She took what I had to say. She listened to my points, and then she revisited simply out of love to inform me and to change the way I think of things. And so that approach was so powerful for me. I think I internalized that, and I use that in my classes. So I think that's a big part of it. But I've kind of delved in, you know. I find things to read everywhere now, and I find stories everywhere and people to talk to everywhere. And I push myself. When we teach our classes, one of the things that we believe in is that we are not the sage on the stage. So we do not fill these empty vessels. We are also on our journeys. So every semester, I'm working on my journey, and I'm working on maybe the same cultural group, maybe a different cultural group every semester. And it helps me not only remain on my journey, but be empathetic to those that are just starting their journey or wherever they might be on their journey. So that's where it's taken me with this.
Sure. Thank you. Davies?
Well, as you might imagine, I've had numerous critical incidents in my life that have shaped my view of the world, and the world according to power theory that I am trying to create. And so beginning as a child, elementary age child in my home, I listened to my mother and father who were continuously in conflict, daily conflict. And one of the things that I overheard on several occasions was my father used a pejorative term to describe one of our ethnic groups, racial ethnic groups in Trinidad. And my mother, who was very educated, my dad was functionally illiterate, or he was illiterate, or functionally illiterate. And my mom would say to him, do you know what that term means? And of course, my dad did not know. And so she would say, here's the dictionary's definition. This individual has a name, call him by his name. If you don't know his name, ask him his name. And so that was my first introduction, my earliest introduction to the issues of race, ethnicity, and culture. And so as got into my secondary school years, and one of my brothers, I'm the last of six, so the second brother I had would bring one of his friends home who was a gay man. And so I questioned. My mother embraced him as her own son, while my dad would use pejorative terms to describe him. And I debated with myself, continuously reflected on my mother, who is religiously inclined. How could she invite and embrace someone for whom the Bible would look upon in negative terms? And so that was my other experience that I had at home. I've had numerous in addition to those, and I would share one that has been ever so present in my mind that occurred last semester, because it has to do with Amy and my philosophy to that point. In my classes, I introduce students to the pejorative terms ascribed to different racial groups. And I always start with the term used to describe me. And so I've done that since 2009 when we started teaching these courses. Amy's contention was, Davies, those are pejorative terms. We need not use those terms in our classrooms. And I beg to differ, right? She's on her journey, I'm on my journey. Well, of course, I am acutely aware of professors who have gotten into hot water, right, using those terms in their courses. Right. Well, that was not my experience till last semester. So I had a Hispanic, a Latinx, a Latina student in my class. And on that day, I described the terms. I started with me, and I said, this is the term that's referred to me. This is what I'm called. And I referred to her. This is the term she was called. Taught for an hour, break time, took a break. I'm in the hallway. She comes to me in tears, brokenhearted, forlorn. She says, Dr. Bellamy, I have never been referred to in that manner. And the light bulb that Amy had been trying to turn on for those 11 years finally went on. I may be at this place in my development to understand and use those terms. They've been used against me. I've experienced them directly. But this young lady's innocence was shattered. Now, was that my intent? No, for all these years, it has never been my intent. But the impact is that I crushed somebody's soul on that particular day. So finally, I've arrived at the place that Dr. Amy has attempted to help me arrive at for these past 11 years. That's not the world that I want to create. And so that is one of the experiences that I have had that have shaped my life and have really helped me to appreciate the value and to understand my journey. And as Amy shared earlier, to approach others in such a careful, nurturing manner so that they can go on their journey.
Thank you for that. Zaya, I want to provide the opportunity. Don't feel like you're on the spot, but is there anything you'd like to add to the comments here?
Well, for me, I feel like I was raised different than most of my counterparts. When I went to the dynamics of my school. I went to Seaway Public Schools from K through 8, which is predominantly Caucasian. Then I went to Providence Christian High School, which was a shakeup, which was majority minorities. They're Latinas and Latinx, and then they're African Americans. That was my high school. So it was a culture shock for me and myself going to that predominantly minority high school, because even though I am African American, I was raised a little bit different. I was raised around Caucasians. So a lot of my identity, I wouldn't say was necessarily lost, but it was kind of, I didn't know who I was because I was always referred as too white for the Black kids and too Black for the white kids. So for me, in my own skin, within the African American community, I just always felt like the outsider. And then coming to a predominantly white college, and most of my friends that I made in college came from very small, white, closed-in towns. And some things they would say, I'm like, I shouldn't be, I was offended by it, but I'm like, I can't allow myself to be offended by it, because they honestly, they're just ignorant. Not to put them down or anything, they're just ignorant. And they need somebody to tell them. And that's why I would go to their towns and just experience it for myself, so I could see what they grew up around, so I could see what I know what I was dealing with, so I could educate them. So the next time they run into more African Americans or people of a different race, they know how to handle them because they didn't have that background when they were younger.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Did you catch what she just did there? And it's quite natural, because we've had enough of these conversations that I hope you all see just how natural it was for her. But she started talking about herself, right? So her own background,
Right.
Talking about how she relates to other people. And then she didn't just keep it at that, right? She immediately moved to, I went to where they came from and witnessed it for myself. Right? So I think oftentimes what can happen is when we start talking about cultural competence, we make it seem as if, I don't think this is intentional, but it comes across as it's the white people who have to do this work, and those who are the racial or ethnic, whatever the minority group is, are the ones who kind of idly sit by with arms crossed, waiting for the white people who are on the journey to come to us. This is relational.
Exactly.
And Amy and Davies, you both said this too along the way. So this process, while it's something that it's a part of your personal journey, there is an element to this whereby you are, someone's walking with you. Amy, you talked about the person that you were with at the conference. Davies talked about actually both of you talked about how you work with each other along the way, but the journey is still yours and you're contributing to each other's development. I think that's absolutely crucial. So while the kind of the early steps and the ongoing process is the self, it is doing that work in relationship to other people.
Yes.
It's not talking about walling ourselves off, right?
Right. I do need to give Zaya some props for providing a good example of student as teacher and teacher as student.
Yeah.
Because that's a good example of
it is a very good example, right? Yeah.
Exactly.
So, go ahead.
In your previous seminars, webinars, we spoke to Dr. Brewer on the intersection of race and the arts, Dr. Stein on race and religion, and Dr. Jen on race and public health. And you would see that our work is really an extension of what they do in their classrooms.
Yes.
To quote Dr. Stein, and you could correct me here, Rob, that she attempts to complicate students' thinking on the variety of race and religion, with the whole idea of inviting them to think more critically, more deeply of these issues, of these topics.
Yes.
And so that's very important. By extension, Dr. Jen talks about the institutions that have been in place for a very long time in the public health area. And so we participate in those, she says, unconsciously, without really knowing that we're keeping those alive. And so our work then builds on those with respect to what do we do now? There has to be action to change those institutions,
Yes.
to change those policies. And we often see that as the other. It's out there, it's in society. And we have a difficult time seeing that how we participate in the maintenance of those policies, of those institutions.
Yes.
That's why it's important for us to get in touch with our awareness and our worldview, our journey, our attitudes and beliefs and values and assumptions, because those drive the decisions we make that form those policies and then proceed to keep them in place. So we talk about culture as opposed to simply race, because we are all indoctrinated into a culture and we filter our experiences through those lenses.
Yes.
And if we're unaware of what's in that bag, or that baggage as we call it, then how can we not but participate in the maintenance of all and sundry?
So let's do this. I think this is a really nice segue. So in the Department of Education at UE, that was academic departments are just like anything else that humans create, right? It is an expression of the values, the training, the beliefs of the people who create it. How did your department come to the point of even offering courses like this? Like, how did that come about?
Davies, go ahead.
Sure.
You started it. You started it.
Well, in 2007, 2006 rather, our dean at the time, Dr. Penland, was immersed in diversity and intersection of diversity and education. And so she is a public health practitioner or public health professional, but as dean and residing on our floor where the School of Education is housed, she became acutely aware of the ineffectiveness of how we educate our students, pre-service teachers. She saw some deficiencies. Well, you know, the literature is replete with enough examples, plethora of examples of the ways in which teachers are doing a disservice to their students, especially across culture and across race and ethnicity. And so she tasked us with the potential changes of educating our pre-service teachers to more effectively teach in our global village. And so she asked us to offer this course, in this international immersion cultural course in Trinidad and Tobago, which we did. Amy?
Well, and during that trip, even though the students are on their journey and talking and so forth, we had several people, Lynn Penland, Davies and myself, and some other educators and some other people that joined us, Jean Moll being one of them. And we also engaged in conversations and working through our own growth and so forth. And Lynn came to us, actually she had a nice conversation with Davies where she said she finally gets it. She finally embraces and understands white privilege, and she finally understands certain concepts. And so when we came back from Trinidad, we were all on board and we were all ready to go and make a difference and say, okay, now what? And the now what was to create some courses to help our students become teachers that were more empathetic and more competent in dealing with people who were not like themselves. So we started at the freshman level, getting them introduced, getting them into schools that were more diverse, and letting them see what are the reactions to that. Many of our students came to us from schools of majority white populations. And so when they are going to be teaching students of all different varieties, they didn't know how they were going to respond to that. So that freshman course took place, but we couldn't stop there, because not only could it be that, but we had to build upon that and get deeper So we developed the junior senior level course as a way to check to see if the things we have changed throughout all of our classes in our program have made a difference. So in researcher fashion, we wanted to have pre-test, post-test data. And that's where it originally started, but it's developed into much more than that. Between using the IDI as a pre-test in their freshman year to using it as a post-test when they take the 385 course. The 385 course then became available to any student, not just education majors. So the scope became not how do teachers do this, but how can anyone in any profession work on their own personal journey in cultural competence. And when we look back and reflect on these classes, it's almost like the beginning courses are the beginning of the knowledge phase, and the junior senior level course is more the action and the reflection and taking that next step. And it's very personal. So that's made a very big difference. I think probably one of the things that, Davies, you might agree, I think you'll agree with this, is that in that junior senior level course, our students pick a population that is personal and important to them. So while they're not focusing on 60 million different cultures, they're focusing on a particular culture, could be race, ethnicity, religion, whatever, that for them personally, they know they need growth. They need to work on. And so the reflection has to happen to identify that. And then their work and their actions are toward building competence in that area. And because it's personal, they become more motivated. And we know with even students in any class, if they're motivated, they're going to be more focused. And that's what we have found. And the end of the semester papers have been just heartwarming.
Yes. So in the midst of that, you've talked about the IDI, or the Intercultural Development Inventory. Let's take a few moments to talk about that, to introduce or to acclimate our those who are on the call to what that instrument is, and why do you use it?
Well, the instrument is actually a 50 survey questioned survey developed by Mitch Hammer, and it's based on the Intercultural Development Continuum, which is kind of the theory that we use as far as development. It's one of the few quantitative surveys out there that actually will show students where they think they are and where developmentally, where their foundation lies. And so we can get data and numbers. We can compare pre-test, post-test data, which for the researcher makes them very happy. But for the theorist and for those of us teaching with our hearts, we really ascribe to those 5 levels of the continuum. And the students may grapple with where they are told that they lie, but once they understand them, they come to accept that and then further grow on it. But the first level of that is called denial, which is the bubble. That's you really don't have to go anywhere. You can stay within your own culture. You're comfortable there. You don't necessarily want to explore other cultures. To polarization, which is the us versus them. You start to notice that there are significant differences. You may not understand why, but you notice these differences. And within that, there's the judgment, where you might be overly critical of the other culture or overly critical of your own culture. And both of those are monocultural mindsets, because you're focusing everything based on your own personal culture, because it's what you know. On the upper end of that is acceptance and adaptation, where you accept that there are differences and you accept that there are similarities, and you're working through that without the judgment. And of course, adaptation, you're willing to adapt your mode to better communicate and better work with and better to get along with others, not expecting them to change, but rather you're willing to make that adaptation for a better world. And in between those, because that's the global mindset, is the big, huge level of minimization. And that's the bridge between the two. And in minimization, you tend to minimize those differences of people that you see that are other. And you are looking instead for the similarities, the universal truths. And this is where assumptions tend to get made. And sometimes the mistake of identifying individuals as part of the group and making assumptions that way, as opposed to individuals themselves, that they have maybe their own unique qualities. And it's a very long phase because so much education needs to happen in that phase. You have so much to learn, that knowledge part that we picked up on, but then how can those actions happen and how can you get past the judgments? Because judgments is hard, you know, that's a hard thing to get past. And to work on recognizing that, yes, there are people who have differences and how wonderful it is that they do. And how we must embrace that unique quality of people who happen to have differences. Because if everybody was the same, gosh, it'd be so boring. Our lives would be absolutely just miserable. And so you hear the phrase, if you don't see color, you don't see me. That's kind of where people in that minimization phase, that's what they're working on, is I need to see you and not judge you, but rather embrace and accept you. And that's what we focus on.
The other facet of the IDI is it provides an intercultural development plan that is tailored to each of the orientations, each of the stages, so that individuals know what they can do, their experiences, their strategies, their steps that they can take to move from one orientation to the other. So it's growth oriented, it's developmental oriented, it's progressively oriented. And of course, it's a lifetime work. It's not something that occurs in one semester, in 1 year. As I've shared with you my personal experience earlier, it takes time and energy, but with intentionality, we can get there. We can make significant changes toward achieving that competence.
So, yeah, go ahead.
As we come to the end of this Zoom panel, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A part of it.
Yeah, and we'll make sure that we get to those. We've got about about 8 minutes or so. Let me kind of thread the needle on this a little bit, because one of the things that I really appreciate about the University of Evansville is this really what I would see as a crucial sense of identity for the institution, right? It's when we talk about education for the whole person. So we're not just talking about the intellectual work that we do. It's also not something that we expect to be, that happens within 4 years. And once you graduate, you're finished with that work because you have quote unquote arrived. This is about something that is far more vast than that. And in our conversations, we've talked about world building, kind of this co-creator. We're after something much bigger, right? Davies, do you want to talk about what's kind of the big strategy, or at least the big idea behind what is it that we're trying to prepare students for? Like, why are you doing all this? This is a so what question.
I have to, I have to channel Paulo Freire again.
Yeah.
And I have to admit this. For several years, when I taught in the master's course in public service administration, I would read in his preface his reaction to his response to describing his contribution, his enormous contribution to humanity. And so this is what he says. He says, I hope that what endures is my faith in men and women and in the creation of a world in which it is easier to love. Mm-hmm. And so for about 5 years, you know, I would reread those lines. In the meantime, I had a number of experiences in my classes where I reduced students to thinking skills and writing skills and teaching strategies. And so those students, as you might imagine, did not really care for my classes or for my teaching, because I lost sight. I lost sight of the student, and I focused on the skills. And so the 6th year, I reread the statement and realized that I was indeed missing the point. The point was in addition to inviting and encouraging students to be better thinkers, better writers, better teachers, better employees, what I was really attempting to do was to channel, or what I should have been doing was to channel Dr. Furry's response. We're really trying to create a world in which it is easier to love. So all our life's work is really about creating that world. And it could be a world in which it is easier to love or otherwise.
Yeah.
But we're daily participating in the creation of a world.
Yes.
And
Okay.
I think we also talked about the fact that within that creation that, yes, we are teaching people who are going to go out and teach students and hopefully continue to build that world in that way. But I think we'd be remiss in not mentioning that we have also used the IDI with all of our faculty, because our chair, and Sharon Gieselman, has made it very clear that she would like to pursue this within our department.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of our faculty have actually been starting their journey and working on their journey using the IDI as a guideline, which I think has been powerful.
Yeah.
So it's not just our classes.
Right, and I've shared this with you all. The reason why I think it's so important, the work that you're doing, and I'm excited to see what's happening, within, the School of Education. I see this as a model for how our other departments on campus, academic departments, can do this as well. Especially, I like that process of using the IDI as a quantitative tool to be able to measure where one is at, develop a plan, and kind of really embark on this journey, but then also come together as a department and as a unit to be able to start to ask those critical questions about how do we take what we're doing here and infuse it into our curriculum for the experience of our students. So that's very exciting. Zaya, I do see that we might have a question or two. You wanna start helping us walk through these, or any questions or comments?
Okay, this comment is from Karen, and the comment is, thank you all for sharing with us from your personal and professional experiences. I am grateful for the work you do at UE and the many gifts you share with our community. I feel like we are collectively having a critical moment in 2020, and I hope that many people will choose to embrace growth and become more culturally competent. Thank you for giving us some tools to get started.
Awesome. Zaya, did you have any questions or comments as you've participated here, sat in on the conversation?
No, sir.
All right.
I might mention one thing. Karen mentions the critical moments, and we've talked about critical incidents. Critical incidents can be emotional and painful, but they're so incredibly important for growth, because unless we get something to shake us up, we're not going to wake up. And this is happening. You're right. 2020 has been a mess of all different kinds of things, but a lot of people are becoming more aware, and it's causing you to think. It's causing me to think. And critical incidents will do that. And sometimes you revert back a little bit and you do the work, and it takes you that much further on your journey because of that. So, it's good not to shy away from critical incidents. They're important. They happen.
So let me share this. I'll borrow from your work now. You like to highlight the works of others. So in this this piece that you and so Amy and Davies have been working on, this comes from the section on critical incidents and impact. So, and you're right. So while diverse cultures share many similarities, frequently the cultural differences are the elements that tend to provoke conflict. Of course, those differences are filtered through cultural lenses, an inevitable outcome, since culture is the acquired knowledge people use to interpret, experience, and generate behavior. The intersection of these differences and cultural lenses give rise to critical incidents, which can be used to reflect upon cultural assumptions about ourselves and about others. With analysis of critical incidents lie opportunities for students to examine their cultural filters, namely their perceptions, attitudes, beliefs, and values. Thus, critical incidents are invaluable in the journey toward achieving intercultural competence, end quote. I couldn't agree with you more. And I want to thank you for participating, sharing your time and your wisdom and experience with us. Zaya, I also thank you for your help. I'm hoping that as we continue with this program, that there will be greater involvement and insight from our students. We have one final session that will happen next week. Dr. Kevin Gray, from the Associate Professor of Criminal Justice at the University of Evansville in the Department of Law, Politics, and Society, will be joining us at 1 o'clock. And you can imagine what we'll be talking about. We'll be talking about criminal justice and community policing. So that should be a rather exciting conversation as well. Thank you so much, everyone. And I look forward to seeing you in the coming weeks. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.